this is a topic on which I have been working in pieces for some time. When Rachel announced this conference, I was already engaged in two what I thought were separate research projects on conflicts between Muslims in 18th century China. One, the Kalandaria case in Yunnan, and the other, the rivalry between the Khafiyya and the Jahriya in Gansu. These didn't seem to have anything to do with one another until Rachel Harris suggested sound as a unifying theme. And I jumped at it because it makes such good sense. Obviously, we can't know much about the actual soundscapes of the unrecorded and unannotated Qing frontiers of the 18th century, what things actually sounded like. But in both of the cases I've been studying, we know that sound itself played an important role. So the conference offered me an opportunity to put the two cases together. I'm very grateful for that chance and very pleased to have the opportunity to hear tomorrow's papers as well. My main points in this talk deal with Gansu. It's a much more thoroughly attested case. We have a great deal more information about Gansu than we do about Yunnan in terms of Islamic practice. But I want to begin with the earlier case in Yunnan to outline some of the grounds of Qing legal concern about Islamic sounds. Why would the Qing be legally concerned with Islamic noise? And I'm going to try and introduce the problems with the case of the Kalandars in Yunnan, and then move to Gansu, where we have much more thorough documentation. I assure you that I won't be making any claims that the soundscape caused the conflict. In fact, quite the contrary. I'll argue that sound mattered less than it's usually held to have mattered, at least in the Gansu case. But the Qing courts held that vocalization and dancing were symptomatic of disorder in both of these cases, and upheld the claims to Islamically orthodox rectitude on the part of the sober-sided and non-vocalizing party to these lawsuits, condemning those who made what I call in my own internal code bad noise, condemning them as heterodox. One of my main problems lies in determining what orthodox, zheng, and heterodox, xie, actually meant in these cases. One side invariably accused the other of heterodoxy, but on what grounds would a Qing judge, universally and abysmally ignorant of Islam, come to a decision? Not Islamic grounds, certainly, but rather Qing legal grounds. And therein lies my tale and the importance of sound in both cases. This is the Qing Empire. I'm going to be dealing with two pieces of it. One is here, Western Yunnan, and especially a county town north of Kunming here. And the other is here in southern Gansu, spilling over into northeastern Qinghai. Of course, in the period that I'm talking about, Qinghai and Ningxia did not exist. This was all part of Gansu. In 1710, that is the 49th year of the Kangxi reign, a Muslim gentryman of Western Yunnan, the gentleman Ouyang Laoshi mentioned as Ma Zhu, received several communications about a divisive and potentially subversive group of Muslims, foreign Muslims, who had arrived from the West. We don't actually know where they came from. The surmise is generally that they came from India, but they came from the West, which in the Yunnanese case could be Burma, could be India. Ma Zhu himself thought that their influence might have trickled down from Shanxi, but he didn't think much of Shanxi and thought that they may have been doing bad things up there, which came down through Sichuan and into Yunnan. Ma Zhu called these people Gelandai, Kalanda, and he described them as antinomian Sufis. According to Ma Zhu, though they used Islamic texts, these Kalandars nonetheless drank alcohol, smoked narcotic drugs, probably hashish, and seduced women. As Alexandre Papas has vividly described them in his 2010 book, people like these Kalandars, we might call them tantric Muslims, sometimes disdain the orthodox Sharia in order to achieve more emotional unity with the divine, perhaps through such unorthodox means as drugs or drink or sex. This is not at all uncommon in mystical religion. We find it in the histories of Christianity and Hinduism certainly, but other religions as well. We find mystics departing from conventional religion in order to achieve more spectacular and perhaps more rapid ecstasy. The Kalandaria happens in a lot of places. It's usually associated primarily with Central Asia, with Afghanistan, and later with India. But there are Ottoman cases of Kalandars in which specific orders were persecuted, but not Sufis in general. Alex Papas will join us later this evening and tomorrow and knows far more about the general phenomenon than I do. Here in Yunnan, the action of our story takes place here, north of Kunming, in a county called Wuding. That's where the Kalandars landed. Ma Zhu had studied there as a young man. It was a major Islamic center, as well as a borderland between Chinese culture and the hill country people then known as Lolo and now known as Yi. Ma Zhu, in fact, may have been living there at the time. Ma Zhu was both a Sayyid, a descendant of the Prophet, and a well-known Muslim literatus, a Wanren. One account claims that he actually had passed the lowest level of the Qing official exams and become a xiuzai. In that position of community authority, Ma Zhu received reports from Wuding County imams complaining about the Kalandar's dire effects on local society and begging for his intervention with the officials at the county, the prefecture, and the provincial levels. By Ma Zhu's own account, which is our only source for this case is not attested in any other source. And so obviously our source is very biased in the matter. By his own account, Ma had been aware of the Kalandar's presence for some time, but the local leaders' description of their excesses, including, according to Ma, adultery, orgies, indiscriminate mixing of men and women at night, dancing, drinking, and combining religion with ecstasy, they so infuriated him that he did in fact take his case to his friends at the Yamen and pleaded there as a local gentryman to push the Kalandar case through the court. This is what Wuding looks like. It's stunningly beautiful. It's in the mountains north of Kunming, and one of its most famous local sites is, for our purposes, one line of Ma Zhu's description of the Kalandars merits special attention. They probably looked something like this. This is an Afghan Kalandar, not an Indian, but this is very much the sort of outfit that these guys would put on. Describing the malign influence of the Kalandars on local society in Wuding, he wrote as follows: 淫秽之声遍满道路. Obscene sounds fill the streets. And we as scholars, and especially at this conference, are left with the problem: what is a 淫秽之声? A pornographic sound. I frankly haven't the faintest idea. Ma Zhu himself modestly does not tell us what the obscene sounds might have been, but elsewhere in the passage he notes what he found most abhorrent about the kalandars. And this is the passage just previous to obscene sounds filling the streets. Here are some more kalandars, incidentally, though they may or may not be making obscene music. These guys are clearly doing bad, bad things. The foreign way arrived and circulated. The people came in a constant stream, men and women indiscriminately mixed. By day they plucked the strings and beat the drum, drinking their fill among the forests and streams. At night they transmitted the Tao among the bright lanterns, causing their breath to descend into their lower abdomens. Old women and young girls, cloistered elites and village maids, stayed all night in the mosque to study the way, to study the Tao. They drank alcohol, they played music, but we don't know what kind, by day. They practiced mystical breath control by night. That's that business of having the breath descend into the lower abdomen. I haven't yet been able to find anyone to inform me authoritatively that whether this is or is not a sexual reference. It's certainly common enough to describe mystical meditation practice as circulating the breath through the lower abdomen. But it might also be a sexual reference. They certainly encouraged indiscriminate mixing of the sexes. Now, in order to live comfortably inside Chinese culture, Muslims like Ma Zhu had to perceive themselves and be perceived as conforming to orthodoxy as the Ming and then the Qing state defined it. Heterodoxy of any kind, spirit possession, forming networks of sectarians, and especially violation of gender separation, remained in the law codes as crimes not of ideology or thought, but of social behavior. The proscribed acts included creation of charms, especially encoded in esoteric languages, like Arabic, incense-burning ceremonies, meetings which take place at night without distinction of gender, and many other practices which Ma Zhu could, probably with some factual basis, associate with the kalandars. Music, in this case, then, resembled doctrine. Its content mattered less than its context. Its working out in social behavior was what rendered it heterodox. The heterodoxy of the kalandars lay in their deviant acts, not in what they thought or in what music they played. They drank alcohol and allowed promiscuous mixing of the sexes. Therefore, their music was yin hui, obscene. They played music and drank their fill out in nature. Therefore, they must be judged immoral. So we can call the music obscene without making any comment on the music itself. It's about what social effects are being demonstrated in the performance of the music. Now, the judges who heard this case at Ma Zhu's request were relying on the Qing statute on heterodoxy, 邪教. 邪教is very clear. Even ordinary music, like banging on drums and gongs, which, as all of you know, happens everywhere in China all the time, becomes heterodox if it is performed in improper circumstances, especially the circumstance of the mixing of genders. And here's a quotation from the statute. If anywhere amongst the people gods are received or welcomed, or thanksgiving meetings held, or if the people pass through internal frontiers to present incense sacrifices anywhere, or play on drums and cymbals, or hang out flags and set up banners, thus giving occasion to both sexes to mix together, then they are committing a crime. Those acts in and of themselves are not criminal. But if they are at the occasion for the indiscriminate mixing of the sexes, they become heterodox acts. Ma Zhu knew that statute. He was a well-trained scholar of the Neo-Confucian tradition and therefore of the law. He certainly knew the legal categories that the statute mentions as relevant to this problem of heterodoxy, of xiejiao. He actually mentions two of them in his account. 左道, the left-handed way, heterodoxy, and 异端, spiritual heterodoxy. These two terms are both mentioned in the statute, where it talks about 左道异端之术, techniques of heterodoxy. In other words, what's being punished is not belief, but behavior. It's the techniques that matter. Music, in and of itself, did not constitute heterodoxy, but when combined with immoral behavior, sound became obscene. Now, the Qing did not have the technological capacity, no pre-modern state did, to create the homogeneous political space of a modern nation state. But like earlier empires, they did attempt to create a homogeneous cultural moral space throughout what they saw as the Chinese cultural area. This is a tradition that goes back at least as far as the Song, and probably much, much further back than that. Those of you who are in sinology will remember that Zhu Xi himself, the great Neo-Confucian originator, was sent to Fujian to improve the marriage customs there, which were, of course, wild and barbaric. The Qing permitted, even required, that the 5 cultural zones of their empire remain culturally and linguistically distinct, but they did attempt to enforce a sort of Sino-Manchu orthodoxy in Yunnan, even its wilder Muslim edges. Ma Zhu, a Muslim Neo-Confucian Wenren, a literatus, played a small part in that work, acting decisively to defeat what he saw as the heterodox practices of the Kalandars. And he saw them as simultaneously heterodox in both Confucian and Muslim terms, though he would argue very differently for the nature of their heterodoxy. When he argued for a Neo-Confucian heterodoxy, he focused on indiscriminate mixing of the genders. When arguing for an Islamic heterodoxy, he focused on alcohol. With that background and these legal categories in mind, let's examine the much better known case of conflict in Gansu, 60 years later, in which 2 Sufi orders vied for supremacy and accused one another of heterodoxy, which apparently to them was a thought crime, though we're going to see how complex it is to make that judgment. And on both sides, the heterodoxy involved sound. Sound has been a crucial factor in the Islamic history of Gansu since the 18th century. 2 antagonistic groups, the accounts tell us, contended over whether Sufis should recite dhikr, the remembrance of God characteristic of Sufi practice, silently or aloud. Zikr is a highly repetitive, almost mantra-like, trance-inducing practice in which formulae are chanted over and over and over, hundreds, even thousands of times, often counted with rosary beads, until the participants enter into a mystical union with the divine. The dhikr can be recited either silently, in the heart, or vocally, with sound, and both types stemmed from the rich Islamic life of the Middle East and India. Some accounts claim that the founders of both of these Chinese Sufi orders studied together. But their rivalry became so turbulent that it caused lawsuits, bloodshed, and over a century of violence. The contemporary historian from Taiwan, Zhang Zhongfu, narrates the conventional differences between them. I'm giving you this passage because it is precisely what most people will tell you. Zhang Laoshi is a very good historian working from standard sources. The major differences between the other manhuan, the other Sufi orders, and the new teaching, Xinjiao, represented by the Jahriya, those who chant aloud, in their exercises in search of the way, tariqa, lies in their loud recitation of the remembrance of God and praises of the Prophet. All kinds of religious dhikr, precisely the opposite in content of the low voice group, the Khafiyya. One 18th century account, which Zhang Laoshi used, describes a Jahriya follower in contrast to the silent Khafiyya in this way. He made wild speeches, manifested the sages, wagged his head back and forth, and recited scripture while dancing. Now, what's heterodox about that? We will find out. Oops, sorry. I'm too tired to work this computer properly. Hang on just a second, I'll get back to where I should be. There we are. Gansu Difangzhi, a local gazetteer of the 20th century, summarized the matter as follows. Old teaching, that is Khafiyya, and new teaching, Jahriya, are mostly the same. But when old teaching chants the scriptures, they raise their hands upward together, while the new teaching raises them separately. The old teaching sits upright when chanting scriptures, while the new teaching repeats over and over, wagging their heads from side to side and rocking their shoulders. Now, these are all Sufis, but one group appears to be the sober-sided sort of perhaps Naqshbandi Sufis who sit quietly and practice dhikr internally, and the other appears to be wilder and crazier, dancing, manifesting the sages, perhaps even spirit possession, wagging their heads back and forth and dancing. And from this difference, according to the conventional account, emerged a century of bloodshed. Now, the area in which this is taking place looks very different from Wuding down in Yunnan. It looks sort of like this. Pretty barren, pretty dry. We're in the southern part of Gansu province and the northern part of Qinghai, what is now Qinghai, along the Yellow River. This is Ariane Dwyer's turf, and she'll be talking about it tomorrow. This is Hezhou, Linxia city, a new mosque, obviously, but a place of many, many mosques going back sufficiently far that it earned the name of Makkah Sagira, Little Mecca of the Gansu Muslims. Two Gansu Muslims, we are told, Abul Futuh Malai and Wiqayat Allah Ma Mingxin, both from the Hezhou area, from Linxia, went west in the first half of the 18th century to undertake the pilgrimage and to study. Both of them gained initiation in Sufi orders, including the Naqshbandiya, the Shadiliya, and perhaps more. We don't really know. Here are the conventional accounts of these two gents and the origin of their conflict. Malai Shi went to the Middle East in the 1720s, studied in Mecca with Muhammad ibn Ahmad Aqila al-Makki, and returned to Gansu in the 1730s, bearing, among other things, the text Ming Sha Le. He advocated silent dhikr and founded the Khafiyya Sufi order. Khafiyya, of course, refers to silence. Ma Mingxin went to the Middle East in the 1740s, studied in Yemen with Abdul Halik ibn al-Zayn ibn Muhammad al-Mizjaji, and returned to Gansu in 1761, bearing, among other things, the text Muhammas. He advocated vocal dhikr and founded the Jahriya Sufi order. Jahriya, of course, refers to jahr, the vocal practice. Both of these guys clearly brought Persian and Arabic texts home with them. Now, because Gansu pilgrims' experiences of the Muslim heartlands were very rare and precious. Not many people did this. These texts supposedly became central to the practice of the Sufi networks these two men founded. Both of them received mawluds from their teachers, celebrations of the Prophet. But their teachers also gave them texts that our accounts tell us became divisive. Ma Mingxin Amu Hamas, a lengthy poem in praise of the Prophet and very often of Ali as well. And Ma Lai Tzu received from his teacher a text called Ming Sha Le in Chinese. Mawlud and Muhammas are well-known genres written by many different authors. We actually don't know which Mawlud and which Muhammas these guys received. But what's the Ming Sha Le? Now this is going to get confusing. So let's make an immediate connection. Ming Sha Le, Ma Lai Tzu, Khafiya, silent dhikr. Okay? That's what you get from this conventional account. In a famous passage, the late Joseph Fletcher speculated on the identity of the Arabic text Ming Sha Le or Min Sha'ar. Ming Sha'ar. Neither Professor Fletcher nor the authors of his sources had actually read it. So he based his conjectures on the title's possible meaning and on the text's content as described by the Qianlong Emperor, who also hadn't read it. He called it scriptural extracts. He, of course, didn't write that himself. One of his people did. Now, Ming Sha Le is always linked with Ma Lai Tzu and the Khafiya, so it should follow that the silent recitation of dhikr would be characteristic of its ritual and of its readers. For the Khafiya claimed in legal documents presented at court that they performed their mantra-like dhikr silently, al-dhikr al-khafi. Having discovered that Ma Lai Tzu's teachers in Yemen were Naqshbandis, which was an extraordinarily difficult historical discovery, Professor Fletcher concluded that the Ming Sha Le's title and content must be associated with conventional Naqshbandi devotions. Mainstream Naqshbandis perform the dhikr silently, as Hamid Algar keeps reminding us. Fletcher focused on Ibn Arabi's Fusus al-Hikam and its commentaries, many of which contain words for light. Chinese Ming, which is the first character in the text's Chinese name. This was an association for Fletcher in which Ming would be used for its meaning rather than for its sound. Some Chinese texts, incidentally, when transliterating Ming Sha Le, use a different Ming. Ming meaning dark or sinister. They try to associate this text with nasty stuff rather than with brightness. It is, of course, a transliteration. Fletcher didn't know that. We do now. Now, here are names for the two types of dhikr that we can find in various sources. There are lots more, but these are the ones that are relevant here. The silent or low-voiced dhikr, dhikr khafi, dhikr al-qalbi, the dhikr of the heart, or the dhikr siran, the secret dhikr. The vocal dhikr is called dhikr jahri, dhikr alaniya, public, or two different names associated, oddly enough, with a hand saw. Dhikr arra in Persian, dhikr minshari in Arabic. And there's your hint. As I said before, historians invariably place the Ming Sha Le, held within the Khafiya, in the camp of those who recite dhikr silently, in conflict with other texts and rituals practiced by the Jahriya, their rival order, whose adherents vocalize their dhikr recitation. This has always been described as a conflict about sound. Do they vocalize or do they not? We know that arguments and tension occurred all over the Muslim world between advocates of the two forms of dhikr, but only in parts of Central Asia and in China did that confrontation lead to bloodshed. Usually it was conducted in a theological way, in a ritual way, often in treatises, not fistfights. In Gansu, we are told, the conflict lasted over a century and cost myriad lives. When officials intervened in conflicts over dhikr between Muslims, we are told, the conflicts escalated into what the Qing called rebellion in 1781, 1784, the 1860s, and the 1890s. The problem is, and this is where Lippmann enters the picture, we can now establish the identity and contents of the Ming Sha Le, and that knowledge requires that we revise all of these conventional accounts, at least as far as sound is concerned. Why? This is a copy of the Minshar. This is a copy that is owned by Yitzchak Weissman at the University of Haifa in Israel, who has done a book on the Naqshbandiya. And you can see that it clearly is a Chinese copy, at least. This is the cover. See here, Al-Minshar, Huasi Gongbai, the flowery Kubba, the flowery saint's tomb. This is the headquarters of the most important branch of the Khafiyya in China. And those of you who can read Arabic, if you will look here, beginning here, the source of this Al-Minshar text is Al-Sheikh, let's see, where's my cursor? Al-Sheikh Muhammad ibn Ahmed Aqila Makki, whom we all know from other texts was the teacher of Malai Tshir. Okay, I have two other copies of this text. They are virtually identical, and I am deeply indebted to Thomas Wyde of Oxford, who translated them into English for me. My Arabic isn't nearly good enough to translate this stuff. Fletcher correctly concluded that Malai Tshir, the Khafiyya founder, and Ma Mingxin, the Jahriya founder, had studied with the same or with similar teachers. But his explication of the Ming Sha Le nonetheless focused on the Khafiyya versus Jahriya conflict as it appeared in Qing legal documents. He thus never guessed that the two orders' texts, in fact, taught exactly the same ritual practice. Sorry. Down we go again. The Arabic title of this text is Minshar, which means a handsaw, the same as the Persian word arra. This is a reference to the sawing sound made by Sufis when they recite the vocal dhikr, a method called in Persian dhikri arra. In Arabic texts, including the Minshar itself, the vocal dhikr is called dhikr minshari. Fletcher's error as to the title's meaning stemmed in part from the Gansu dialect of Mandarin, or the southern Gansu version of what we now call Mandarin. That version of Mandarin does not distinguish between final N and final NG, so that Ming Sha Le and Min Sha Le are heard as identical. Therefore, Fletcher, who was busy with the word Ming, needn't have been. It's in fact Min. And had he seen that, he might have guessed that he was dealing with another handsaw. The real problem, of course, is that none of the scholars who study this conflict could have imagined that one of the Khafiyya's most central texts bears the title of the vocal dhikr. Since the sometimes violent confrontations between Khafiyya and Jahriya in Gansu are usually attributed to the differences over the silent and the vocal dhikr, the text's title and its content are obviously counterintuitive. Until now, the Minshar text has been exclusively associated with Malai Tshir of the Khafiyya, and thus with the silent, not the vocal dhikr. Given the Minshar's actual contents, however, that association can no longer remain unquestioned. For the Minshar, a core text of the Khafiyah constitutes a litany, ratib, for the vocal dhikr. Here are some examples from the text itself, as translated by Tom Wide. Our Lord, yours is the praise which is bountiful, pure, and blessed, etc., etc. Then they say together with one loud voice, chanting, forgive us, great Allah. They say this 10 or 20 times. Note the great voice. Even more obviously, after they finish their reciting and begin dhikr min shari, it is known by the words, there is no God but Allah, there is no God but Allah, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. They say this 100 to 300 times. Then they all begin together dhikr min shari, and it is known thus, Allah lives, Allah lives. They do this likewise several times. Then they begin by themselves, and it is known thus, Allah lives, he always remains, Allah lives, Allah lives. Then there is a period of dhikr min shari for 2 hours or as much as the rapture and immersion has taken hold of the group. Then everyone says together with a loud voice 100 times, Allah, 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 Allah. That sounds pretty vocal to me. I have a video here of what some of it sounds like. If I can figure out how to do this, I shall. Let's see. Here we are. This is Sheikh Nazim, and he's only doing the very first bit, the repetition of there is no God but God, there is no God but God. You get the idea. Incidentally, if you ever look at this video, it's quite long, and some of the world's cutest kittens are lying at the Sheikh's feet. Now, why is this significant, and what does it have to do with the Qalandar case? The contending Sufis of Gansu took one another to court over a variety of crimes, ranging from illicit mosque building to murder. But the crime most often reported in the sources is teaching heterodoxy to delude the people. 邪教惑众. How could a Qing court decide which Islamic behaviors were heterodox and which were not? And what precedents did they have? Looking at these Gansu cases through the eyes of judges like those who, can I get back to the, oh my, PowerPoint here? Yes, there we go. Very inefficient. Looking at these cases through the eyes of judges, like those who judged the Qalandars to be heterodox and immoral, we can imagine that the behavior of which the Jahriya stood accused, loud chanting, dancing, manifesting the prophets, and so on, appeared more like that of Buddhist and Taoist sectarians than that of the supposedly silent Khafiyah. On the basis of this reading of the Minshar, we know that the Khafiyah were not silent, that they performed the same dhikr as the Jahriya, but they didn't tell the court about it. In fact, they claimed that they didn't do it. If they could persuade the officials that the Jahriya's version included gender mixing, meetings at night, and head-wagging, while their own version did not, they could win their cases. And they did. By the 1780s, that is, only 40 years after Ma Lai-che returned to China and about 20 years after Ma Mingxin did, Qing legal precedent had firmly established that the Jahriya, which was labeled pejoratively as the new teaching, the Xinjiao, in contrast to the Khafiyah's safe and conservative Jiujiao or Laojiao, old teaching, that the Jahriya had disrupted Gansu's social order with its loud chanting, head-wagging, and meetings at night. The Jahriya, in other words, had itself been judged heterodox. Sad to say, given the bloody results of this conflict, some Qing officials actually could connect Jahriya, and even, though they didn't, they could have connected Khafiya practice with that of Muslims in Xinjiang. Agway, one of the Qing Empire's most experienced frontier officials, was sent to Gansu to pacify, that is, kill, a large number of Jahriya adherents who had rebelled against the Qing in 1781. That summer he wrote to the Qianlong Emperor as follows: "The new teaching, the Xinjia, the Khafiya, belongs to the stream of heterodoxy." Right up front. New teaching, heterodox. Done. Finished. However, according to the interrogation, the thief called Ma Mingxin returned from outside the pass in the 26th year of Qianlong to advocate and establish this new teaching, ordering people to chant the scripture in a loud voice. We know that, however, that this is because Muslims who live in every city in Xinjiang, when they read scripture, do so in a loud voice, a great chanting. Your servant Agway has always known this. That is to say, it's perfectly ordinary, says Agway, for Muslims to chant aloud, to say dhikr aloud, to perform the dhikr jahri. But the new teaching has already been judged heterodox, so there's no going back on that. Add to this the irony that the silent ones, the Khafiya, held the vocal dhikr close to their hearts inside the Minshar text, which they associated with their founder, Malai Tzu, and his teachers in Mecca. With far more disastrous results than in Yunnan, but based on the same sort of reasoning, the Gansu officials determined that one group of Muslims was Xie, heterodox, and one group was Zheng, orthodox, at least in part based on the contexts in which they produced sound. To conclude, how can we think about this? If it's not about the vocal dhikr, not about the sound itself, we have to look for other reasons why the Khafiya and the Jahriya went after each other with such vociferousness in Gansu. Why did they do it? The Khafiya lied in court, we know that. They said they chant aloud and wag their heads and we don't. It's possible that the Khafiya didn't wag their heads, that they only chanted aloud. They may have been a modified version of the dhikr jahri or minshari. But there are other ways to think about it than just about the sound itself. As I read from John Lasher's text, conventionally, this conflict is held to be a conflict about sound. What we now know about the Minshar indicates that it probably isn't, because they were using the same dhikr. I'm taking my hints here from Professor Isenbike Togan, a wonderful historian of Sufism in Central Asia. In an article about the Khafi-Jahri conflict in Central Asia, she wrote that the problem is lack of tolerance among frontier Muslims. Each trend from the Islamic heartlands that arrived in these frontier zones solidified quickly into a new orthodoxy. Professor Ma Qiang's paper tomorrow will deal with this in a much more contemporary fieldwork situation in which a variation of the call to prayer, forced by the Cultural Revolution, became orthodoxy, ironically, among the Jahriya. Professor Togan finds that intolerance of this kind emerges in Turkestan, on both sides of the Pamir, in the 17th century. And that peripatetic Sufis like Malai Tzu and Ma Mingxin, who probably studied in Central Asia as well as in the Middle East, propagated it in China. Why would Muslims accuse one another of heterodoxy? in part because of the rigidity and intolerance generated at frontiers when truth arrives from distant heartlands. In part because issues other than sound were at stake, mosque building, for example, and the donations of followers. And in part because they held the Qing courts to be the only available arbiter of social order. This is fairly unusual. In order for them to apply to a qadi, they would have had to go all the way to Xinjiang. And that was not possible for Gansu Muslims. They applied for justice to the Qing courts. It was the only authority to which they could appeal for dominance over their immediate local rivals, and they did so by stigmatizing them as heterodox. As in Yunnan, we find in 18th and 19th century Gansu, sound was a symptom of heterodoxy, not its content. Thank you.